So it's a real pleasure to be here. I was very happy to get this invitation, and it's been fun for me preparing this because I'm going to tell you some stories which I've told many people, but I've never written down. And integrating these stories of my time with Arendt as her student, she was my dissertation supervisor, with my current work on judgment is a new project for me, and it was fun to do it, so I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. And I should say that, of course, I'm going to be summarizing and compressing a lot of stuff, and so if there's anything that isn't clear, I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions at the end. So, a little introduction to me and my background that led me to work with Arendt. So, coming of age in the late 60s, Vietnam, the civil rights movement, protest politics was really central to my life. And I really passionately wanted to understand the world, the politics of injustice. I got my BA in psychology, but I didn't want to continue in that because I wanted a graduate school that would give me a path to the broad understanding I was after. I should say that I never considered either political science or law, the two disciplines in which I've worked for all my professional career. I don't have degrees in either. I was looking for interdisciplinary programs, and I looked at a lot of them. And I settled on the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, in part because Hannah Arendt was there. I'm going to talk about Hannah Arendt's theory of judgment, but it's important to know that she never wrote that book. She planned a 3-volume set on thinking, willing, and judging, and she published the first 2, Thinking and Willing, but she only got as far as selecting a quote to open the judging manuscript before she died suddenly. But we have her lecture notes, edited and published by my colleague at U of T, Ronnie Biener, multiple essays, and in my case, the experience of being in a seminar with her on judgment. And I've recently, as retired, taken it upon myself to sort through 50 years of papers, and I'm happy to say that I found my notes from my classes with her, which I haven't actually gone back to yet. So, but like many scholars, I'm working on my own reflections on judgment, building on what I understand to have been her ideas. So all of us, we have this freedom and frustration to reconstruct and reimagine based on her preliminary published thoughts. So when I got to the Committee on Social Thought in the fall of 1970, quite early on, one of her senior graduate students came to me and said, oh, you really have to take this course. Arendt is coming in to do this special intensive in January, and you really should do this. And I said, well, what's it on? It's the Kant's Critique of Judgment. I said, yeah, and what's that? And he said, oh, it's about aesthetics. No, I do politics. I'm not interested in aesthetics. He said, well, you go read this essay of hers, which I did, The Crisis in Culture, which has the kind of germ of her approach to judgment in it. And I said, right, this is what I want to do. And it was something I've never actually seen replicated in the academic world, which is so that Chicago's on the quarter system. So for the fall quarter, many of the faculty and many of the graduate students met together and worked through Kant's Critique of Judgment. So by the time Arendt got there in January, we really had gone at the text and figured out what our big questions were and our disagreements with one another, and then we had this intense, kind of explosive, wonderful seminar for 3 weeks. And by the end of that, I thought, right, this is the person that I want to work with. And I want to add to that moment the background, which is, as an undergraduate between 1966 and 70 at the University of Rochester, I never saw a female professor. So then to meet Hannah Arendt, clearly the smartest person I'd ever met and the smartest person on the committee, which was a group of stars, they had no junior faculty. It had an impact on me, which I think I'm still trying to understand, what it meant to be able to work with this woman after never seeing a woman in academics before, and she was the only woman on the committee. So by the end of that seminar, I asked her if I could spend the next fall term taking her course at the New School, because although she was a member of the committee, she was hardly ever there. She really lived in New York and taught at the New School. And then later, I asked if she would supervise my dissertation, which she could do because she was a member of the committee. And she said yes to both, which has shaped my life and my work in ways, as I said, I'm still discovering. And lately, I've been able to appreciate both the courage and the determination to work with her that it took to make those requests at 21. So I want to start with, and this, I've brought with me a little show and tell. This is me going up nervously hunched to ask a question at that seminar on judgment. So I'm going to start with 4 stories from that period of my life to give you a bit of a sense of her and my relation to her and her ideas. The first is one that I find amusing, but also an indication of the limitations of Arendt's own judgment. So we were going up in the elevator to this seminar on judgment, and I was a very active feminist, and I had my Sisterhood is Powerful button. I don't know if any of you still remember those. And she looks at me, and she looks at that, and she says, "This is not serious." So I like to think that if she'd been around longer, I could have brought her around on that. So the next story, Saul Bellow was the chair of the committee when I was there. So when I got her permission to go to be in New York, I needed to let him know I was leaving town and was going to spend a semester in New York, and I thought I needed his permission. So he says to me with a sneer, "You mean to say you want to go all the way to New York to work with Hannah Arendt? Are you sure you're not just doing this because you have friends in New York?" And I was so insulted on so many levels, both about the sneer and, the suggestion that I would possibly just be dishonest. I just sat up and said, "I am absolutely sure." And he decided not to cause any trouble. So I was able to go, and the committee was a place with very few rules, so I never had to ask him anything else again. But later, after I told this story to many of my colleagues because I was, so outraged at this. And they then told me something that I had been completely ignorant of, which was the huge outcry that the book Eichmann in Jerusalem had caused. And there were many in the Jewish community who wrote ferociously antagonistic reviews, and many who wouldn't speak to Arendt after it. The main points of contention was the subtitle, "The Banality of Evil," but also her drawing attention to the role of Jewish councils in participating in the extermination process. And it turned out, so I didn't know about this, actually, and I, in particular, didn't know that Saul Bellow was part of that, that he really took great exception to the book and to Arendt. So next is a story from my time in New York City in 1971 and 73 with her. So she taught one seminar, which I went to. And at the end of her classes, she always had a party at her apartment on Riverside Drive. She would invite the students in her class and graduate students over. And I have still vivid memories of sitting on the floor listening to her stories. And somebody said to me, "This is like children at the feet of the grandmother." And it was kind of like that. And she told lots of different stories. And the one I remember best is the one where she talked about she was arrested in Germany and was held for 3 or 4 days. And she talked about how she had always thought the hardest thing about imprisonment would be to be without cigarettes. But she said it turned out that being without coffee was worse because she felt she needed to be absolutely alert at all times. And honestly, I can't quite remember whether it was the regular police or the Gestapo that had brought her in. But she couldn't feel confident about her alertness because of no coffee. Anyway, unlike many other Jews at the time, when she was released, she left the country the next day. So that was part of why she was ultimately safe. And it was really in contexts like that, rather than in our one-on-one. I would go to visit her in her apartment each time I had a chapter of the dissertation to send. And I sometimes tell my graduate students, when I would get a new graduate student, I said, "Yeah, look, I have to explain to you something. I cannot do for you what Hannah Arendt did for me," which is when I told her that she would have a chapter on, February 15th, it was there, because there was just this sense of awe and, which I didn't think I could extend to my graduate students. So I said, it's your job to meet your own deadlines, because I just can't do that part of it. Okay, so now I'm turning to something that is connected to the, still part of these stories, but to the substance of what I really want to talk about. So in one of those seminars I was in with her at the New School, she said, I can't actually remember the context, that in democracies there will always be people who refuse to think critically. They just won't engage in critical reflection. And I found this so disturbing that I actually got up the courage to make an appointment with her in her office hours to ask her why she said that and what does it mean. So I told her, I went and saw her, and I told her that I found it very disturbing, and I asked, well, how can one design and organize a democracy if you have to start with the assumption that people won't think? My dissertation was on the writing of the American Constitution, so I was very focused on what does it mean to design a new system of government. And she said, the real danger is to design a democracy assuming everyone will think. And now, as I go back to her work on judgment, my current interest, I see that she said similar things using the word judging. And there's a complex relationship between judging and thinking for her, which I'm not going to go into. But she says the same thing about both terms. When she talks about judgment, she says that everyone has the responsibility to make judgments. And in particular, by the way, she rejected the idea that no one who hadn't lived through the Nazi regime has the right to pass judgment on what those who were there doing. She said, no, we all have the responsibility to pass judgment. She also said, so she said everyone has the responsibility to judge, but she also said that there will always be people who refuse to exercise their capacity for judgment. And I might note that I have taken up this question of responsibility to judge when I teach feminist theory, because some of you may know that some of the more recent feminists have accused the feminists of my generation of being too judgmental. And, feminism is whatever you think it is, and, free thought, and who are we to judge? And I don't think being judgmental is the same thing as assuming the responsibility to judge. But I really spent, a class or two trying to talk about what it means to take responsibility, to make judgments about things that we think really matter, both politically and morally. So the question of people's capacity and responsibility for judging and thinking critically is really the center of what I want to talk about tonight. In preparation for this talk, I went back to Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I had not reread for a long time, and I really do recommend it to you, even if you read it years ago. It's very accessible, it's very interesting, and really thought-provoking in this particular time we're all in. As some of you will know, the New Yorker sent Arendt to Jerusalem to report on the Eichmann trial. The book is, of course, about the trial and its background and all the dimensions of what was going on in Germany. But even though she says it's very important to see what the trial was and was not and shouldn't be, I see two kind of additional projects in the book, which she does insist were not properly the object of the trial. One is to make clear the complete moral collapse of Germany, the complicity of everyone, ordinary Germans, clergy, judges, state officials of all kinds, and complicity that she keeps noting carried forward to post-war Germany in the willingness to let almost all those people carry on with their jobs in the post-war Germany. So one part is recognizing and understanding this vast moral collapse that took over a whole people. And the second question, which she doesn't really try to answer, of how that could happen runs through the book. But one thread of what she sees, which connects to the main point, is this mass failure of thinking and judging, which is, of course, not what the trial was about, but it was that experience that I think really alerted her to the puzzle and hope of a theory of judgment to address these things. So let me say a little bit about what Arendt understood judging to be, because she had really quite a distinct understanding of this. She thought of it as one of the human faculties. Thinking, willing, and judging are things we all have the capacity for. And she was drawing on, as I mentioned earlier, the aesthetic theory of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. I won't bore you with many of the details, but the part that's important is that he argued that the act of judging involves taking the perspectives of others into account when one is forming one's own judgment. That's what it means to actually judge, is to take the perspectives of others into account. So Kant was writing aesthetic theory, but I think it's helpful, the analogy to the aesthetics can help us clarify it. So he makes the distinction between a statement of preference. I like those hangings there. That's just a statement of my preference. It makes no claim on you. If I say those are beautiful, he says the meaning of that sentence is, I have made a judgment that they are beautiful, and it makes a claim on your judgment. Just stating a preference doesn't make a claim on anyone. And so I think one of the ways of thinking about what calls for real judgment, to having to do this work of taking the perspectives of others, rather than just forming an opinion or stating your preference, becoming aware of a preference, is to think about what kinds of things we care, whether our friends agree with us about or not. So, for example, we don't care whether our friends prefer Thai or Italian food, but if a book we love, our friends think is trash, or reversed, that's a problem, right? And I think it's helpful, and I just invite you to reflect on what kinds of political judgments, everyday judgments, say about what's a good school, who's a good neighbor, what's a good newspaper article, falls into the category of things that you care about whether your friends agree with you about, and whether you want to make a judgment about it that will make a claim upon them. And in order to do that, you then have to do this work of taking the perspectives of others. It's important that Arendt takes from Kant's aesthetic theory of what both he and she call reflective judgment, that these are judgments whose correctness can never be proven. I cannot prove, even though I'm making a claim of validity, I can never prove that that painting is beautiful. By its nature, it is not subject to proof. What she and Kant mean by that is that if you're really making a thoughtful, disinterested, autonomous judgment of beauty, then I'm claiming that if you too were making such a decision, you would also find it beautiful. But again, to go back to you can't prove it, all we can do is woo the consent of others. That's her beautiful translation of one of Kant's phrases. Persuasion is another word she uses. So this is this unprovable claims that matter, that are claims of validity, that are based on taking the perspectives of others. All of this is entirely different from what she and Kant call determinative judgment, where there's a general rule that can be applied to a particular instance, and you can show that the outcome is determined by that rule. So mathematics is the obvious case. The less obvious and wrong case is law. So both Arendt and Kant thought that law was a matter of determinative judgment. There's a rule, you apply it to the case, the outcome follows. That is not, in my view, how law works, and I think most people in contemporary legal theory now also don't share that view. So judgment is always about particulars in contexts where there's no determining rule to apply. And this is also why judgment is so important for novel events, when the previous rules won't work. And so again, that's part of the importance of the Eichmann trial. She thought the crimes of the Nazi regime were novel, even though she notes that ethnic cleansing was not. There was something distinctive about what happened in the Nazi regime. Is this where I want to do this? Okay, I'm not sure I picked the right spot, but I'm just going to read one section. This is the only part I'm going to read, which tries to capture this absence of rules as being essential for what she means by judgment, by reflective judgment. So she's talking about the Nazi Germany. Those few who were still able to tell right from wrong went really only by their own judgments. And they did so freely. There were no rules to be abided by, under which the particular cases with which they were confronted could be subsumed. They had to decide each instance as it arose because no rules existed for the unprecedented. So what makes something a reflective judgment and not just a private opinion is that the person making the judgment has done this work of what Kant and Arendt called exercising this capacity for enlarged mentality, that we can enlarge our scope of understanding by this work of taking the perspectives of others. At one point, Arendt says that we can all have our opinions. You know how people say this, well, you're entitled to your opinion. Well, that's fine, as long as you, without doing the work of judgment, as long as you understand that those opinions have no validity in the public realm. They're just a private thing you've got, and yeah, you can do that. But she also adds that our judgments are only valid. We can only make claims of validity upon others whose perspective we've tried to take into account. Now, there are many debates on the human ability to take the perspectives of others. Arendt says that what she means by that is not empathy. And there are complicated things about the extent to which she does a good job of thinking about the role of emotion in judgment. This is not a strong point for her. But what she means by saying that it's not empathy is that we should not be under any illusion that we can ever fully understand how another person sees the world or feels. But that doesn't mean that we can't, and indeed we must, try to take their perspective. And we have this capacity for what she calls common sense, again, she's borrowing from Kant, that enables us to do this. And I will come back to this, but first I want to go back to this crucial question of the capacity and responsibility to exercise judgment. I read her as saying that everyone has this capacity. In ordinary times, the fact that most people will not actually exercise the capacity doesn't matter much. It's okay. But in times of crisis, like Nazi Germany, and I would say, as I'll say in a moment, like today, the failure to exercise judgment is extremely dangerous. In my view, this holds for our dark times, our current context of wars, the rise of authoritarianism, the worldwide failure of the left to provide persuasive alternatives to the massive rise in inequality and its threat to democracy, and the climate crisis. All of these call urgently for the exercise of judgment. So before commenting further on what we can learn from Arendt's approach to judgment, I want to note the other related point of the book, the banality of evil, which was part of the huge controversy over the book, especially in the Jewish community. What I understand by this phrase is that she thought it was urgent to understand that what happened in Nazi Germany was a new kind of evil, something traditional legal categories were unable to capture. What she saw in Eichmann was a man incapable of thinking and judging. He was a man of cliches. He cared about his own status and his own very limited conception of what his responsibility was, namely to carry out Hitler's law, which was distinct from following orders. And in the trial, there was kind of a big deal that there was a moment when he refused to carry out an order from Himmler because he thought it was not consistent with Hitler's true law, which was the extermination of the Jews. This was at the end of the war. What mattered to Arendt was that someone who was not a rabid anti-Semite could become pivotal to the project of transporting Jews to the concentration camps and the gas chambers. Eichmann had started out with a project of getting all the Jews of Germany to emigrate. That was his project, and he was going to organize the transportation and everything. But he did realize that that project had been abandoned by the Nazi regime in favor of extermination. And he just took his bureaucratic skills and applied them to the new project. He was, like so many other Germans, able to overcome the teaching, this is something she comes back to many times, thou shalt not murder, in favor of Hitler's command to organize as many murders as possible. What Arendt saw in Eichmann was a small-minded man, not a passionate anti-Semite, who could organize mass murder with a largely clear conscience. He had found a fairly high position, though he aspired to higher, and he wanted to do a good job of it. The banality of this banality of evil arises because the heinous acts arise not out of hatred or passionate commitment to the Nazi project of eliminating Jews, but rather to a radical failure to reflect critically on and thus to understand what he was doing. He says in his testimony that no one ever told him that they were troubled by what he was doing or suggested that he should be. And Arendt thinks that was probably true. Being a good bureaucrat, rising in the ranks of the bureaucracy, feeling loyal to the leader was enough to do incomprehensible evil. That is the threat of modern totalitarianism. It fosters the banality of evil, and in many cases, that was sufficient for evil on an unprecedented scale. So of course, it wasn't the harms that were banal. It was what brought them about, was not this rabid anti-Semitism. So I will just take a moment here to say that many people think that Arendt got it wrong on this particular point about Eichmann as a man. And I was actually able to attend a conference in Tel Aviv in the 1990s called Judgment in the Shadow of the Holocaust. And one of the participants was part of the team there prosecuting Eichmann. And it was his job to escort Eichmann to and from the trial to the cell every day. So he had a lot of chance to talk to Eichmann. And he was completely convinced that Eichmann was indeed a rabid anti-Semite. And I was persuaded by what he said, but I haven't tried, some people have, but I haven't tried to sort through the historical evidence of was or was not Eichmann a rabid anti-Semite. What I think matters for our understanding of Arendt's contribution, and indeed of the Holocaust, is that Eichmann and his trial alerted Arendt to the phenomenon of the banality of evil, whether that was an accurate characterization of Eichmann in particular or not. So Arendt helps us see a massive failure of judgment in Nazi Germany, but she says very little directly about what can foster good judgment and the willingness to exercise this capacity that she believes everyone has. So as we start to think about that, I want to raise a kind of puzzle. To me, the idea of taking the perspectives of others implies a process that takes time. You sit down, you pay attention, you try to imagine these different perspectives. And the same with a critical reflection on one's assumptions or routine categories of thought. That also implies this sort of deliberation and time. But I think we have reason to believe that some of the very kinds of judgments that started Arendt's thinking about this don't seem to take that form. So a colleague of mine interviewed people who were in Amsterdam when the Nazis occupied it. And she spoke to people who had rescued Jews, hidden them in their houses at great risk, not just to themselves, but their families. And she also talked to people who did nothing. Nothing to protest, nothing to protect, nothing to resist. And those two groups of people sometimes came from the same families. The striking thing to me is that when she asked why they acted as they did, both groups said the same thing. What else could I do? Neither described agonized periods of indecision. It seemed obvious to each that they must act as they had. There was no real choice to be decided on. And of course, we're left with the question of why the need to help those in peril of injustice was so obvious to some, while it appeared impossible to others. And of course, also, it's not hard to understand, given the Nazi tactics, why many people felt action to help or resist was impossible. What is striking in the context of a crucial moral judgment is that both groups saw the answer as what to do as obvious and opposite to one another. And the fact that some of them came from the same families makes a simple recourse to upbringing, education, culture unavailable. My own best guess the study did not really come up with answers that helped me with the puzzle, is that some people do exercise the capacity for judgment on an ongoing, though of course not constant basis. We can't constantly be critically reevaluating all of our concepts, all of our values. When I taught courses on judgment, I would always tell my students that I thought the verb exercise, to exercise the enlarged mentality, to exercise judgment was important. We have to exercise our capacities regularly so that they can be available in times of crisis. Of course, for those of us in relatively safe and secure, wealthy countries that are not war zones, we actually do have time to reflect on what our best judgment tells us we should do, to resist and protest injustice, to change our habits, consumption, driving, flying, to be consistent with what we know about climate change, to work for foundational restructuring of unjust economic systems. What to do and even what to advocate are not always obvious, and of course will not always agree even with those who do share our basic values. And that is why taking the perspective of others matters so much, and why it sometimes seems so hard to do when those perspectives seem incomprehensible and sometimes morally bankrupt. So there's a great deal of literature now on what perspective taking means, what we're actually capable of, whose perspectives we ought to be taking. Here I just want to raise two issues, and then I'm coming to the end. Arendt talks about a community of judgment, those whose perspectives we take. We can't take the perspectives of everyone in the world. She's talking about communities of judgment, and I think this idea of community is important. This is a group of people who share enough in common that we can use our common sense to take their perspectives, and who have enough diversity to give us a range of perspectives to take into account. Now, in one of my earlier articles, I wrote, it was called Communities of Judgment and Human Rights. And there I was trying to think about how we make universal claims of human rights, and people purport to make judgments what are in fact across quite different communities of judgment. And I try to talk about what does it mean to now think about judgment in these new terms of judging across communities, especially since many of us now live in more than one community of judgment, who sometimes do not share core values. So what happens to judgment and perspective taking in those contexts? And now there's yet a further challenge that I'm going to just mention, which is that my work now, as Harriet noted, is now on the more than human. And my claim is that we face this still greater challenge of taking the perspective of animals, plants, rivers, ecosystems into account. And this is so even though most of us have very little training or experience in how to do that. But as in Arendt's approach to human judgment, it's not just a mark of respect to take another's perspective into account. It actually is the only way we can be truly judging. The only way we can make good, well-informed judgments that are not just personal opinion. Of course, this extension I'm making is based on the belief that the more than human entities that we're entangled with are fellow subjects, not just objects to be used, even used wisely. This view is the result of a change in my assumptions, in my judgments, that I think needs to come to be widely shared if we are ever to respond adequately to climate change and create a planet that can sustain a great diversity of life. So finally, I want to return to a suggestion about this question of what fosters or undermines the human capacity for judgment and critical thinking, and the willingness to exercise that capacity. I'm sure that there are many pieces to this puzzle, but I want to share one example that I've learned about. Aaron Mills, an Anishinaabe legal scholar at McGill, also a former student in one of my judgment classes, is working on articulating the form of law that he sees as a core part of the Anishinaabe social and political system. One key aspect of that form of law is that there is no centralized authority for implementing, imposing, and certainly not coercing compliance with that law. As I read his work and interpret our conversations, he presents a story of a structure of relations in which each person, indeed each child, bears the responsibility of living according to the core values of the tradition, Values such as love, truth, bravery, honesty, respect, and humility. These values, sometimes called the grandmother or grandfather teachings, are conveyed through stories and through examples. The key here, from my point, is that each person, each child, learns that they are responsible for figuring out what it means to uphold those values in each instance of life's decisions and actions. They will receive guidance and support, but no one will tell them if they got it right or wrong. With rare exceptions, no one will punish them for getting it wrong. I see this as a heavy burden and a great gift of relations that foster autonomy and community, the kind of autonomous judgment that Arendt values. For her, reflective judgments, as she calls political judgment, are always particular, and by definition, there are no rules that can determine the right outcome, the best judgment. That is why the capacity for judgment is so important. There are so many political and moral, though Kant didn't think it applied to moral judgments, that cannot simply be determined by rules. Of course, she talks about how the Nazis inverted the command, "thou shalt not murder," to "thou shalt murder." The command, "thou shalt not murder," could presumably have determined that the mass extinction of the Jewish people was a crime, an evil prohibited by what one might have thought was a shared rule, but particularities always matter. Are soldiers in war an exception to that rule or not? In Nazi Germany, one had to exercise judgment to resist the transformation of the rule against murder that was happening all around Germans under the Nazi regime. Stories of exception, of leadership, of greatness as justifying this transformation all had to be resisted. So in closing, let me say that my story about Anishinaabe law does not, of course, provide any simple answers. It's hard to see how the model of law that Aaron Mills articulates could work at the scale of modern societies without major social reorganization, some of which, by the way, I think is a good idea. I think the nation state is both too big and too small to handle the transformations necessary to respond to climate crisis. But leaving such macro transformations aside, let me close by suggesting that what we need to do is ask ourselves how we can foster among ourselves and our children and grandchildren the capacity to judge autonomously in community, to think for themselves, even as we understand those selves to always be in deep interdependence with others, human and more than human, and to understand that taking the perspectives of diverse others will be essential for that project. Thank you.